Okay, hello and welcome to QuaranCon 2020. This is our first panel of many exciting ones. I am P.S. Livingstone and we are talking today about fantasy book series, how long should they be? Before I introduce our wonderful panellists, Stephen Arian, Megan Haskell and D.P. Williscroft, just remind you guys to please... Oh, okay, now I'm... Hang on. I'm going to mute that. That was a great start. Let's try that again. Just to remind you to visit Artists Alley. We have a lot of people showing their artwork, their books, opportunities there. Since a lot of cons are cancelled, obviously we want to try and make this as big as it could possibly be. So thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like you guys to introduce yourselves, please. Stephen, would you like to go first?
Sure. I'm Stephen Arian. I write epic fantasy. I've got 2 trilogies published with Orbit Books, and a new duology starts next year with Angry Robot Books.
Fantastic. And Megan?
I'm Megan Haskell, the author of the Senyari Chronicles, which is a fast-paced fantasy adventure featuring a kick-ass heroine, her carnivorous pixie sidekicks, and a quest across 9 fairy realms. I'm also the co-founder of the Author Wheel, which is a website where we help writers become authors and keep their stories rolling.
Fantastic, thank you. And D.P. Williscroft?
Hi, I'm Dave, stands for the D and DP, and I'm an author of Epic Fantasy 2. My series is the Wildfire Cycle. Here is the first book, King's Hold. And it's a multi-point of view epic fantasy that starts with the whole premise of what happens if a kingdom changes into a democracy. So I'm very happy to be here today.
Great, well, thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate that. So we're just going to dive straight in. Question number 1. Book series come under many guises. For you, what determines a series and how broad can that story or content be? Megan, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Actually, so I have a few different definitions of series. I think that you can have the traditional trilogy or fantasy series where it's the same characters, the same going through an adventure over a period of time. But you can also have standalone series where each book is related. They're the same world, but it might have different characters, but it still continues an overarching world building arc or something like that. So there are a few different ways you can actually define series. So it really kind of comes down to what kind of story you're trying to tell.
Okay, yeah, fantastic. I think I would agree with that. I think, Dave, you had talked a little bit about sort of that, particularly with Discworld, didn't you?
Yeah, because I was thinking about the answer to this one, and at the start I was like, oh, a series has to be like one overarching story with an ending. And then I was like, oh no, because I totally think of the Discworld books as being a series, even though they're all standalone. Some of the characters never return. And then, definitely kind of in the publishing order, it would take sometimes years before you would revisit characters. But to me, that's like an awesome example of a series. But then on the flip side, like, the First Law trilogy that Joe Abercrombie did, like 15 years ago, I just read his new book, which is kind of like revisiting some of the characters. And that is definitely, in my opinion, not the same series. It is like a different series that has now begun, but it completely fits still the same logic that I just said for Discworld. So I don't know, you've confused me already.
Excellent, then. Aim achieved, I think you'll find.
I think some of that has to do with marketing, though, as well. Like you can take standalone books that are all part of the same world, but because you've set up your marketing on that aspect of things where it's, kind of similar covers, similar entry points, you can just mix it up. That's totally cool. But you can also do, like, one of my favorite authors is Nalini Singh, and she writes the Psy Changeling series, which is like 15 books, or might be getting closer to 20 now, I don't know. But she actually has 2 main entry points. So it's all really the same series, but you can start in different places. And it's the same overarching world building, the same story arc kind of behind the scenes, all the politics and that kind of stuff. But each book is also standalone in that they're paranormal romance. So there are 2 characters, and that character's romance is a standalone story within this bigger overarching series. So it's really cool. It depends on how you're trying to tell your series and how your story and how you're trying to bring readers into your world.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen, you've we've obviously talked about kind of really broad, 15 kind of long series there and Discworld Standalone. Are you a fan of those kind of books, or do you kind of like the more traditional 2, 3, 4 series, and do you consider other ones a series as well?
I'm kind of somewhere on the fence, thinking what Dave just said about the Discworld books and the Abercrombie books. Hello, who's the cat?
Hello, cat.
Do you all hear her?
Yeah, we
do.
do.
You're here. Anyway, so the Discworld, obviously, that's part of the same world in some ways. But if you look at someone like Robin Hobb, who's written 20 plus books set in the same world. Now, she didn't set out at the start, say, oh, I'm going to write these 20 books and all these different trilogies. She wrote a trilogy, and then she went, and then later on did another trilogy, and then came back. And now people regard them all as kind of the 20 books set within the Assassin's world, or whatever it's called.
Mm-hmm.
And surely that falls under the same remit as Discworld and Abercrombie's, because he didn't plan necessarily to revisit with his new trilogy, which is Age of Madness and A Little Hatred is the new book. I'm thinking, let's see, this will be technically his 7th book in the same world, if you're following that same kind of pattern. I tend to write more traditional 3-part, 4-part, 2-part set within the same world, but that was planned from the start. So does it come down to if it was planned or not, or does it not matter until afterwards?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really fair point. I mean, I think people tend to traditionally think of a series as being a bit shorter, and I think what we've done there is really to highlight that actually that's quite often not the case for some of the most successful authors, is that actually they haven't done that. But when someone says a series, you go, oh yeah, Lord of the Rings trilogy. I think that's a natural response from people. Do you think?
Absolutely.
Anybody can jump in.
Go on, Megan.
Oh, I was going to say, absolutely. I think, that the trilogy is the classic, right? Like, I mean, starting probably before Lord of the Rings, although I can't think of any examples at the moment, but Lord of the Rings kind of set that up. It's a single story arc following the same characters through their adventures across 3 books. But I think he originally didn't write it as a trilogy, right? Am I correct?
Yeah, I don't think so.
No more than I.
I don't even think of it as a trilogy anymore, because I've always got like the big edition on my shelf.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one book.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
well, I guess
for publishing reasons, I think he had to break it up or something, and so it was different. But yeah, that's kind of the classic.
If you took out all the songs and stuff, it'd have been a lot shorter.
And Tom Bombadil. Okay. What was the point of Tom Bombadil?
I just made myself hated
too much walking and too many walking trees. It's all about walking. Yeah.
It's a lot of walking.
There was a lot of walking. Yeah. Okay, well, that kind of leads us really well into our second question then, which is talking about the sort of, particularly within fantasy, and they are famous for their trilogies. I mean, that's kind of where it kind of started out. And J.R. Tolkien and others have really kind of set the bar perhaps for what classically readers expect from a fantasy book. So have trilogies had their day? Dave, I know, do you want to jump in? Because I know you have an opinion on this.
Sure. I mean, but I'm going to just show myself as being extremely indecisive about all things, basically, I think. Because I mean, trilogies always have a place, because they can be really great, because in the first book, you're quite often introducing the characters and the threat, and there's some stakes there, but then they get bigger, and, you kind of normally left on kind of like wanting to read more. Then in the second book, usually you like give the characters an even harder time and have them, potentially dangling by a thread at the end. And then the third one is kind of like, woo, happy ending, fireworks at the end, everyone's back in the Shire or whatever, right? So that will always work, and Star Wars keeps churning out the bloody trilogies too. So
waiting for you to bring that up.
Yeah, I know. But like, I mean, I do like kind of books that have a different type of approach. I mean, one of my favorite series of the last 10 years or so, maybe it's longer, was the Dagger and the Coin series by Daniel Abraham. That was 5 books. That I thought that was really excellent. And then I mean, I probably shouldn't even talk about my own books, but like, I'm just doing something kind of stupid, which is where I think that, so for the cycle, there's 4 books, but then I decided that I want to publish books of short stories between each of the major novels. And so actually it's 7 books, but it's like this combination of novel and short story together. And then, I think that you can do interesting things now, and like, you can just not be constrained within that trilogy. But I do think personally that the smart thing to do, like from a commercial perspective, is if you can do that thing more like what Megan was talking about, or maybe more like what Terry Pratchett did by accident, which is if you got a series of standalones in an overall, kind of world where people can hop in and hop out wherever you like. I think that's probably the best for readers in terms of being accessible and kind of then being successful that way. But,
okay, yeah. So I mean, you're sort of saying that you so basically, if I was to sum up, trilogies perhaps have had their day, even though you love them, and you like to see something a bit different that people can hop in and out of. Is that fair?
yeah, I mean, I don't know, because I still I'm gonna read the Age of Madness trilogy, and it's gonna be great. And I just think it's a classic form. It's the same way that the hero's journey works so often kind of in books still. It's like, is anyone going to stop using the hero's journey? I don't think so.
Stephen, do you want to jump in? Do you have anything to add?
I don't think trilogies have had their day, but I think how you structure a series depends upon how you're doing it. If you're traditionally published, and you came in and said, I've got an idea for this 27 book series. I'd have to do all 27, and it's really important that it's 27. They'd be like, I don't think so. Let's start with 2 or 3. And if that works, we'll do 3 more, and then maybe 3 more. I mean, so you go back to the really ridiculous ones, like somehow they worked out, but they're really uncommon, where a very, very young Jim Butcher said, I've got this great idea for this thing called the Dresden Files, and it's 20 books, and then a 3-book apocalyptic trilogy at the end. And his writing instructor was so happy that he'd finished the book, she didn't, want him to dissuade him from that, and said, yeah, that's fine. And now we're currently on book 16 of the Dresden Files, 20 years on. But the difference is they're standalone books on a case-by-case basis, like the Jack Reacher books or something like that, where there's a start, a middle, and end to each book, threads that carry over, and they build on each other. So you can't start anywhere. You have to start at the beginning. But that's another way of doing it. And I also think attention span is changing because of the way we consume media, and because there's so much more, Netflix and Amazon and streaming and games and TV and all this stuff. There's so much now that people, if you go in and say it's 800 pages and there's 12 books, even for my favorite author, I'd struggle.
Yeah, I think I'm fine once I'm in, but having to know I was going to start that might stop me. So I think that's a really fair point. Okay, Megan, so I'm going to change the question ever so slightly for you, if that's okay. So kind of talk about that idea. And just throw it out there and ask you if you have a favourite series that is a trilogy.
That is a trilogy with a start, a middle, and an end.
Yeah.
Not just unfinished. I mean, I've read a lot of, obviously Lord of the Rings, I've read the classics and stuff like that. But no, I don't think I have like a favorite or a straight up trilogy that I just go to. I'm trying to think. No, most of what I read are longer series, personally, or they're 5-book series. I've recently read quite a few, like 5-book. What do you even call those? Are those quintets or quintrilogies? I don't know.
I don't know. I was trying to debate this the other day because I went with tetralogy for 4, but I actually prefer the word quadrilogy. But then I was informed that I made that word up, so I changed it.
Well, you know what? I like it, but
but it sounds cooler. I just wasn't sure how to spell it.
Yes.
Yeah, that is, spelling is tricky. But yeah, so I've been reading more that are slightly longer than trilogies recently myself. And I don't know if that's just a marketing thing currently. I read a lot of indie authors. So I think indie authors tend to write longer series because it's easier to market them. Because if you just have to market the first book and then hopefully you get the sell through to the rest of them. So they like longer series, generally speaking. Of course, I'm indie and I'm writing a trilogy right now. It just goes to show.
Yeah, me too. Sorry.
It is what it is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great.
Yeah.
So we're talking about, obviously there have been lots of series. You mentioned the Dresden Files. There's authors who perhaps had intended to write a single book or 2 or 3, but then those series have gone on perhaps long after they intended to, for maybe pressure from fans, readers, publishers, if something perhaps has then been a successful TV series or a film or whatever. what do you say to the pressure to make a series go on longer, and what's the risk to the writer of doing that? Megan, do you want to start us?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the pressure is that if you have a series that's doing well and the end point of your initial planned story, right? So whether that's a single book, a duology, or a trilogy, or whatever you have planned, you get to that end point and there's still threads left open that you could explore from. I think if the series is doing well, obviously, from the publisher's perspective, right, you want to maximize that and you want to, keep the momentum going. So there is going to be quite a bit of pressure there. And then from the readers as well, because they don't want those characters to go away. But I think ultimately it comes down to the writer, and again, the story that they want to tell, and also their stamina. Because, you get to it, and this actually happened to me with the Senyari Chronicles. I wrote the first 3, intending it to be more or less a story arc, a 3-book story arc with the openings for more. And then I wrote book 4, and then I was supposed to write book 5, and I got distracted by Forged in Shadow. So
sorry, I've got 2 cats fighting at my feet. Bugger off. Sorry, really sorry.
But yeah, so like you get to this point where it's like, okay, I need a break from these characters, or I need a break from this particular world. And mine happens to be related. The new trilogy is related to the Senyari Chronicles, but you get that kind of like itch to do something new. So I think from a writer's perspective, there is an aspect of, are you up for a sprint? Are you a sprinter, or are you a marathon runner? What are you capable of within that creative framework? And so that's the risk. You can get burned out, like I think there are lots of authors who they get to book 10 or whatever, and they're going, okay, how do I come up with a new story for this character who we've already explored so much, oh my God. And then it starts to get kind of formulaic and you can start to see in those series when the writer is getting tired. So that's the risk to it.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, it's like Happy Days or like one of those other shows where the Fonz shows up. Like if the Fonz ever shows up in your fantasy, that would be a bad sign.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Stephen, so let's say, we talked about the burning out factor, and the pressure perhaps from the fans to say, oh, we love these characters, we don't want them to go, but then the writer is writing perhaps when their story is ended. Do you think in the end that risks turning the readers off? That they don't then, or they start going fan fiction, say, oh no, you shouldn't have killed that, and then you get misery, basically.
Well, if you think back to some of the biggest writers, even them, when they were publishing their series, they were getting pressure. So more recently, I can think of J.K. Rowling. She talked about some emails she'd get from fans and fans' mothers saying, please don't kill off any more characters, we'll be really upset. And she's like, well, okay, but I'm still going to do it. But things have changed. If you go back to when Sherlock Holmes, of course, and the famous Reichenbach Falls, he fell over and died, and that was it. That was the end. That was the end of the character, and he's doing no more. Spoilers for like 100 years ago. But then they said, well, we want more. And he said, well, I don't want to do any more. But of course, his other stuff wasn't selling, and he needed to eat quite badly.
Right.
So he brought Sherlock Holmes back. So that was pressure from the fans and the publisher, but also the fact that he was a working writer. So we don't quite have that same level of pressure today. And I think authors probably can take it or leave it to a certain degree. I've not seen anybody say, I wrote another book because the fans said I had to yet. I've not seen that happen.
But that's something you would admit.
Well, yes, that's true. You get a lot of hassle in saying, when is the next book coming out? And why haven't you written it faster? And, I don't care about what's going on in your life. Write the book. That's what people are constantly saying a lot to the authors now because of social media directly. So you can understand some of them taking a step back so they don't have to deal with that kind of pressure all the time.
Okay, good. Right. So are there any then series that you wish had gone on longer or should have stopped earlier? Any quick examples? Just Dave, anything?
Yeah, so I thought about this one. And so first of all, like there's pretty much like you can't ever have a discussion about any fantasy books on Reddit Fantasy without mentioning this series. And I love this series too, but it's definitely too long. And that's like the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So have you guys read that? It's like
Sorry, no.
I never read it. Nope.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, look, it's like the two whole blocks on my shelf, and there's 10 books, and there's like, you know, halfway through the series, whole new characters are introduced and different parts of the world that seem to have no connection to what's going on, and basically the whole thing could have been probably better with having like 3 or 4 books less. But I mean, it's you almost felt like the other, Eric said he wanted to, you know, he has written epic and like underlined it 4 times. It's like nobody is really going to beat it in terms of a series unless you're like crazy.
You could underline it 6 times.
I guess so, yeah. So how many books?
That's what I'm going to do for my next book cover, and it's going to be your fault.
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't Malazan 10 books in total?
It is. It's 10 books. Yeah, and then you know, his buddy Esselman, because they kind of came up with the world together. Then he started writing books that go alongside them, like in the same time periods. And I think there's another 4 or 5 of those. And then there's prequels, and it's just like, yeah, then it still starts to get a bit much. Yeah, I can't. I gave up. But I still really enjoyed them at the time. I mean, they're excellent. And
even though you've just gutted them on live on YouTube.
Yeah, and that's right. And I recommend them to people all the time. So it's like, yeah, start it. And then 6 books in, and then, after 6 months, they'll be like, oh, yeah, got a bit slow there, didn't it?
You're really selling it. Good job.
Yeah.
Right. Megan, anything that you think just wished to be more of or less of?
Well, you know what? So one of the classics that kind of got me started reading fantasy way back a long time ago when I was a kid, was the Dragonriders of Pern series. And the first, particularly, I think it started out as a trilogy-ish. I mean, there were 3 books originally. They weren't quite a continuous story, I don't think, if I'm remembering correctly now. But it's been a while since I read them. Anyway, those books I adored. I ate them up. And then, you know, Anne McCaffrey started writing other things, and which totally makes sense, and I get it. And then her son came in to help, you know, continue the series, and it was never quite the same after that, you know, because probably she got distracted. I get it. You know, but I do wish that she had that series. Every time I go back and read it, which I do every, you know, 5-ish years, I go back and read it, and I was like, oh, I wish there were just a few more books in like that she had written in this series that are her mind, her story, and the way that she told it. So that's the one that I always point to, is I wish there were a little bit. I mean, there are more, but more from her.
More direct. From her alone. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Last words, Stephen. What do you think? Do you have a?
I've got 2 that I wish were shorter.
Okay.
And one of them's even longer than Dave's. Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan.
Oh yeah, that puts me off.
So when he wrote the first one, I think this is might be apocryphal, that he wrote the first book, The Eye of Time, and it was a standalone book, and that was going to be the end of it. Because if you read it, it reads almost like, you know, they go to this place and there's a thing and they destroy the thing. I'm being very vague on purpose. And you think, oh, that's the end of the story. And then there was another 14 books after. And of course, he was very, very ill, unfortunately, and they were getting slower and slower. And he knew he was very ill. And Brandon Sanderson then finished the series off for him and wrote the last 3 or 4 books. Mm-hmm. And I was reading them when they were coming out originally. So you'd have like 2 years between the book, and then maybe 3 years between the book, and then maybe 4 years between the next book. And every time you're having to go back and reread them, and it got longer and longer. And I had to stop at one point. I still haven't finished it because of the idea of trying to catch up on a 15-book series that I can't really remember I can't do it. And they were about 800 pages long. The other one that I wish had stopped after the first book, Dune by Frank Herbert, because they go down in quality. And I know there are prequels, and I know his son has written some books with Kevin G. Anderson, but for me, the first book is the best one. 2 and 3 are okay. I don't like the rest. And I reread the first book every couple of years because it's probably my favorite science fiction book ever. And that's it. That's enough for me. That's all I needed.
Yeah, 100% agree with you on that one.
Okay. Yeah. Well, this is one of my later questions, but I think it's quite appropriate probably at the moment then. Which was, there are obviously cases of books where people have either written them after the author's death or when they've been ill. The Wheel of Time was one of the ones that, you know, that I had for discussion. Christopher Tolkien obviously took over quite a lot of work from his father. Michael Crichton, I think Richard Preston finished Micro, and there have been various authors like V.C. Andrews and things where there have been a whole host of ghostwriters who have kind of written in their name for that. So what are your thoughts then of people taking over somebody else's work? Is it a good thing generally? Are there specific cases where you think they made it better? I can't think of one off the top of my head. What's your thoughts on it, Stephen?
I'm trying to think if anybody who's taken over some work that I like other than Wheel of Time, which I just mentioned. I can't think of many that I thought have done it in books in particular with ghostwriters. I know that Terry Pratchett had all of his old books steamrolled so that someone didn't take one of his old ideas and dig it up and use one of his other ideas and try and write something. So no, I can't actually think of anything that's been improved by having someone do more books. I guess probably the closest thing I would say is James Bond novels, because obviously Fleming's passed away and people want more of those adventures. And from what I've been told, I haven't read them, the new Bond novels have been really, really good. But that's part of, I guess, the Fleming estate, and they're making that decision. So I think that's probably the only thing I can think of.
Okay. Megan?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think the problem is that no matter how good the writer who takes over is, typically speaking, you lose that core voice. I mean, it's imitation, it only takes you so far. And so it's the problem with Dragonriders, right? Like I was just talking about, like her son started to come in and help and wrote more of these books. And they're good, they're just not the same. It doesn't have that, there's something about them that just doesn't quite evoke the same emotional response in me as the reader. So I think that's really risky when you do that. Yeah, I haven't read Wheel of Time, but I have heard that Sanderson did a good job with that.
Yeah, I think he did. We're not criticizing
one that I can think of. I didn't even read it. So
nobody's got that far here on this panel.
I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. I think that's one of the reasons why writing is so unique and so much fun, I think, for each of us as writers, you know, is that it is our voice, it is our world and our brain. And even when you're writing in somebody else's world, it's still you coming onto the page, no matter how hard you try. So so I think that's where the disconnect comes in a lot of these cases. It's just not the same, and so you lose.
Yeah, it's not perhaps what you fell in love with in the first place and sort of drew you into the reading. And
yeah.
Okay. Right. Next question then. So we talked about the idea earlier a little bit about the 2-act method of a series. You know, I think Dave, you brought up Star Wars. You get that idea that A New Hope is standalone. Jedi or Empire and Jedi, very much that sort of 2-part act of a trilogy. So do you think that kind of doing, if you were writing a series or a trilogy, that having your first book be able to stand more alone is a good idea in the current climate, the way publishing is at the moment? Dave?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, that's what I did with my book, because I was a new author too. And there's only kind of so many chances to get a new reader to pick up a book by a new author, and then if it doesn't actually have a satisfying ending on its own where they could decide just to leave it at that point, I think it makes it really challenging to attract new readers. And personally, I hate stories where it feels like, or books where it feels like a story has been cut in half, where there is like an obvious cliffhanger. I've stopped reading books where I've heard that's what's going to happen, kind of like as I'm reading it. It's like, okay, well, I'm just not going to bother reading it anymore. So I think the first book always should kind of like kind of take you up on the highs and the lows in the book itself, get you invested in the characters, and have kind of somewhat of an ending where I would think the first book should generally have a positive ending, unless kind of you really do have a name for yourself where you can kind of, and perhaps you are already invested with the characters because they've come from some other series before, but like it should be generally positive, but there could be kind of so those threads that are hanging out there. There's like the perhaps a still a larger menace out there. But there's got to be
larger menace. I like that.
There's got to be an equivalent of at least a boss battle.
Menace,
it's
perhaps?
like, yeah, right.
Medium-sized menace.
Yes. That's for book 2, and then you have your largest menace at the end.
You gotta kill the little bosses before you go after the big boss.
That's right. Yeah.
Big bad. You got to kill the big bad last.
Yeah. I mean, it would suck, wouldn't it, if you just kind of killed the big bad in the first book, and then the next 2 books are just walking home. That would not be.
Like the Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
For example,
Indeed. Other books are available. Stephen, what do you think to that?
So my debut book was Battle Mage, and it was first part of a trilogy. However, wisely or perhaps unwisely, I did similar to Dave. So the first book is standalone up to a point, and I kind of cheated in some ways because the second book follows on, but it's a different genre kind of, and still fantasy, and then the third book follows on again, and it's fantasy still, but it's also a different genre again. So they build on each other, but you can read them as standalone stories. And then some people got to the end and go, oh, I wonder what happens about so and so. Well, if you want to, you can read the next one and find out, or they've got a satisfying ending. But I've also had my cake and eaten it, because of my second trilogy, I had a massive story in mind, and so I did it as one massive book chopped into 3. Sorry, Dave.
Okay. I'm not, well, at least I could read all 3 now. I wouldn't have to wait.
That's what it was. It was my books you heard about. I know. I got you. I see you. So I did that thing where I thought, right, there's a lot I want to pack in. And I was very conscious of that middle book syndrome where people say, oh, the second book, not much happened. So I made sure there's lots going in on the second trilogy. So I've kind of done it both ways and learned something from doing each approach, I would say.
Okay, that's interesting. Megan, do you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, I guess. I think, kind of similar. So I think there are 2 ways to look at this, right? So from the commercial side of things, especially if you're going for a traditional book deal, right? Then having the first book be more or less standalone makes a whole lot of sense, because then you put the first book out there and you kind of see how it does, and it does really well. Then you get contracts for books 2 and 3, hopefully, to complete the story. But if it doesn't do awesome, then at least you won't have too many dissatisfied readers. So there's hopefully, of course, if it didn't do well, then maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, moving on. So I think that there's kind of that kind of commercial risk factor aspect to take into consideration. But then also I think with a tradition or with a trilogy that's a single story arc, I think each of those books needs to have its own arc, right? So you can leave threads open. I certainly do in the one I'm working on right now. You have to, if you're planning this big epic trilogy and you have this in mind, then from the writing perspective, you still need to make sure that each book has its own satisfying arc, even if it doesn't have a straight up conclusion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So I think that's kind of key to keep readers interested in the series, interested in the trilogy, wanting to continue to turn the pages. You have to kind of keep that tension building over the course of the entire story. But that takes planning, which I'm going to talk about in Pliers versus Panthers in 2 hours.
Yes, come back in 2 hours and listen to that. It's going to be great. Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that's kind of, again, it kind of goes back to the story that you're telling. I'll also say too that my co-author or co-founder of the Author Wheel, she writes thrillers, not fantasy, but she writes it's a series, but they're connected standalones. So kind of like what we were talking about at the beginning, each book is intended to be a standalone story, but they're all connected in the world. Some of the characters cross over to different books. And so
is it the world that connects them, or is there a running theme with that as well?
So hers is the 7 Deadly Sins series. So the theme each book is a different sin. And some of the characters know each other, so they make cameos essentially in each of the different books. But each book is its own story set within the same world. It's all set here in Southern California. So she planned it that way. So she planned a 7-book series that was going to be standalone thrillers that you could read anyone in any order, but they all feed back on each other. So, which is kind of a cool, different way of doing it as well. So it kind of depends on you, writer, as the artist. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to say? What kind of story are you trying to tell?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm just trying to chip my next question at the same time here. Okay, Stephen, I'd like to go back to something that you said then for a second there about the idea about book 2. Mm-hmm. People say, you've got that book 2 syndrome, and a lot of people say it's the toughest one to write. You were obviously quite careful to make sure that didn't happen, but would you agree that book 2 is the toughest, if it's a trilogy, or if it's maybe a 4 rather than Dave, who's writing until the end of time? Do you think book 2 is toughest?
I think if you're looking at it from a traditional publishing perspective, absolutely, because up to that point, all the pressure is getting an agent, and then getting the publisher and getting a deal. And all of the focus is on that first book. Everything they're all talking about, they're all excited about it. They're all talking about that first book. You're working on it with them for, a year or 2 years, and then it goes out to the market. And then only at some point during that process to then say, okay, that great thing that we did, that we picked you up for, do that again. And it's at that point, you've spent 2, 3, 4, 10, 20 years writing that awesome book. And then suddenly they said, right, now you've got 11 months. Do it again, please, and have a first draft in. And suddenly that puts a lot of pressure on people, because there's this weird thing with maybe it's just me, but with writers, you're creative on one hand, and you've got to be a business person on the other hand. You're balancing doing so many words to get the book in because it's a commercial publishing thing, or just getting it out to the fans, but also it's a creative and the muse, or whatever you want to say. So it's this constant juggling thing. So that second book can be really daunting from the fact you've gone from, right, I poured my life into this first book. Now I've got to somehow do that again in less time and make it just as good. So I kind of cheated, because my first book was a big war book, and I'm right, I've done the giant war. I can't do an intergalactic war because it's fantasy. I don't do that kind of fantasy. So I cheated and said, right, the second book is a murder mystery set in one city. So I went a completely different direction. And then the third book is kind of post-apocalyptic horror story set in a fantasy world. So I kind of cheated by not having that constant building that you get in traditional fantasy trilogies of, smaller boss, medium boss, big bad at the end of the trilogy. But generally speaking, the second book is just daunting because of all the pressures that are suddenly put upon you that didn't exist before, because you didn't have people saying, well, come on, when are you going to deliver it? When, we need to do this, by editing by this point, and the covers, and, get on with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course.
So that's a really interesting point, Tim. Just how you're talking about switching genres and stuff, and kind of like that there, the middle book. I mean, so because and how you decided to tackle that way. So I had this thought with my books where I wanted to make it so that so even though so there's really 4 main books, by the way, not like millions forever. But
I was just going by your tweet earlier.
Yeah, I know, but it's because I decided I also boxed myself into something kind of stupid at the beginning, which is I published my author manifesto on my website before I published my first book, which was
amazing.
I know it's not a good idea. So it is said that my books are going to be tight, not flabby. King's Hold is set in just one city, takes place in 4 weeks. Kind of all of the characters interconnect, and so the idea was that it was tight. And then the next book is also similar, but it's different city, different stakes, kind of going on. And so then that's what I cheated by putting the short stories in between the books, because it enabled me to flesh out things around the outside, and to then also, do some backstories. But I also said in my manifesto that I was not going to do one of those books that's half traveling. And so the first book was supposed to be about politics. The second book's about religion. And it turns out the third book is a quest book. So there's an awful lot of walking happening.
Shame on you. Shame.
I know. And then the fourth book is going to be a big war book. So it's yeah. So don't ever do that. Future other writers out there, don't ever publish your manifesto. It's not a good idea.
Good advice.
I have to admit, I kind of did the same thing with this trilogy. I'm going to write it fast, and I'm going to get it all out there. Yeah, I'm not even halfway done with the second book yet.
Okay, Megan, I'm going to add to the discussion we made here. Just ask you. So, you've done series things, and with your chronicles, how much retelling do you do in your subsequent books? So, obviously, in your first book, you do a great deal of world building, and you have to kind of draw the reader into and give them a bit of background. How much of that do you revisit? Do you assume that your readers remember and know, or do you kind of recap and add bits in?
So that is a really challenging balancing act,
yes.
And a really good question. I'm not sure I have a great answer, except that you kind of have to go by feel. So I think there's a certain aspect of, at least in my case with the Senyari Chronicles, I did assume.
Coffee delivery. Sorry.
Yeah.
Can I get one too?
Andrea, coffee for Megan.
With my series, I did assume that everybody had, to some extent, read the previous books, right? Because it is a continuous story. They are each their individual book. I have a story arc for each book, but the overall storyline is continuous. So not reading them in order is a little bit problematic. So with that said, how much you tell, I think, depends on where you're going with the story. So I try to, So one of the things that I teach is about backstory and how much backstory you're supposed to put into a book. And this is mostly advice for new writers who haven't published anything yet. Because you always, especially in fantasy, you always get these people who want to have like pages and pages and pages of prologue that's all the backstory and tells all the politics and all the, this king is fighting this king because of this. And
how many of you don't read that?
Right? so the piece of advice that we always give when we teach is that you pretend like you write that all out on a piece of glass, right? And then you drop the glass and it shatters. And you take the bits and pieces of that backstory and you insert them into the story where they're needed. So by doing it that way, you only bring in the relevant parts as necessary. So I try really, really hard not to do an upfront, like, this is what happened, last time in the Senyari Chronicles.
Law and Order.
You try to avoid that as much as
I love
possible.
that analogy, actually. It's great.
Yeah, it's really, it's Greta, my teaching partner, co-founder of Authorworld. It's her thing. I'm talking more about her than I am. I feel like anybody else, but no, it's and she got it from somebody else, to be fair. But it's just this brilliant idea of how you can kind of piece together what is relevant and walk that fine line between too much backstory and too much retelling, and just enough to keep the reader informed of and remembering what had happened. So yeah. That's my very long answer to a question that was very difficult.
Right, and we're trying to fit one more question in just now before we go to YouTube. I've seen quite a few questions coming in, guys. I'll try and get through those in a minute, but I want to ask you guys one more before we see what the audience would like to ask you. So my question is now is, how do you choose a title for your series? Oh, it's going to be really, I'm going to, Stephen, because you laughed, I'm coming to you first, by the way. And then, so how do you generally want to choose a title? And then specifically, how did you choose yours? Stephen?
I came up with some great titles, and the publisher, my agent, went, no. And how about this one? No. And how about this one? Nah. So I got outvoted, basically. That's my short answer.
Sad times.
So we did the first trilogy, and I thought, right, second trilogy, right, now I get to choose. And I said, okay, can we not have the word mage in the title? And they said, well, we kind of need it for continuity. So I've got 6 books with the word mage in the title.
You sound thrilled about it,
Stephen. Yeah.
Thankfully, new series, no mages, no mage in the title. Hooray! That's my answer. I'm done.
Megan?
Oh, I'm the worst with titles.
Fair enough. I hate them as well. I still don't like
I'm
mine.
the worst. They take me forever. In fact, the Senyari Chronicles. What does Senyari mean? Anybody want to guess?
You wrote it. You tell us.
Yeah, it's I looked up, it is part of the world building, rookie mistake, I guess. I went to, there's this wonderful site that translates Tolkien's Elvish language, and I made up a word, and I used that as the title.
Brilliant.
So it means truth seeker.
Oh, love
but
it.
in Elvish.
Okay.
Yeah, but
Oh,
nobody
nice.
could pronounce it, and it was a terrible, terrible marketing decision. And then with the latest series, so Forged in Shadow was the final title that I came up with, but it started out as Crossroads, and then went through a series of iterations that eventually became Forged in Shadow. So it took me a really, really, really long time. So yeah, I think I'm not one of those writers who comes up with the title first. I can't do it. I don't know. I just can't. It takes me forever, and I always ask a bazillion people, and then they tell me what's wrong with it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it's just when you people obviously pronouncing it and things. I actually realised with mine, which was Transcendent Saga, was that it's actually Transcendent's a really hard word to spell. And I actually, on my first mock-up book cover, I spelt the title of my own book wrong. So that was cool.
Nice.
Yeah, thankfully it never went out anywhere, but I was showing it to someone and went, that's not how you spell that. And I was like, oh God. So thankfully it was just me and them. But anyway, sorry, Dave, what about you? What was your kind of thought process to the title?
I don't think I made good decisions here either, really. I mean, I think all the successful names have in the title or of, they're always kind of compound, or there is like a sentence, and I just went for place names, which I like the way they fit on the covers. So it's like Kingshold. Oh no, but then I realized that with the second book that I probably should have something a little bit more complex than the next place is called Ioth. So I added City of Lights, so it could be a little fancier.
See what you did
sounding.
there?
Yeah, yeah. And then so I think that's the approach that I'm taking with all of mine now. And then the short story books end up being like Tales of Kingshold and Tales of Ioth. So
nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Formula.
Well,
that's
let's
the secret.
see if we can get some questions. Sorry, I'm just going to go to the chat here. Oh, there's lots of people talking. Thanks, Phil, for heckling. Okay, from the same heckling Phil, who, if anybody'd like to heckle him, we'll be doing a panel on the 28th. Is it more organic to develop longer series if you are a pantser? Do plotters know what they want right from the start? I'm going to avoid you, Dave, because I know what you're going to say, and ask Stephen.
I plan all my books
Oh,
ahead of time.
Yes, well done.
Megan, tell me you're a pantser, please.
So
Please, they're outnumbering me.
Well, so I started out as a pantser for sure. And so I think in part, that's why the Seniori Chronicles started out as like, I was like, oh, this is, when I got to book 3, I was like, oh, this is kind of a nice ending point for a little first story arc. This is great. Now I'm going to have a new story arc. And then I just wrote book 4, and then I was kind of like, distracted, bright and shiny. So yeah, I think to some extent that's probably true, that I think pantsers, we kind of just go with it, right? We follow the characters where they lead to some extent. Whereas plotters, you have those story events figured out that you want to tell. I'm now somewhere in the middle. And I do know authors as well who plan out 12-book series, in sets of 3. And they have the whole thing outlined before they ever start book 1. Most of those writers write very quickly, much faster than I do, because I'm really slow, sadly, which is why I couldn't release the 3 books altogether like I wanted to. Anyway, so I think there's a range. There's always a spectrum with it. But we're going to talk more about plotters and pansing
yes, that's true. That's true.
In 2 hours.
Okay.
Again, hey, I'm on that one.
If you want to join us, Stephen, you can come too, I'm sure.
Sorry.
Yeah.
He does. Wow. Dave, you just so badly got dinghied there.
I know.
Ouch. He doesn't even look sorry.
He wants a real drink. That's the thing.
That's
I know.
fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Do authors need to be concerned about diminishing sales for a long series, people buying book one but not the next 5? That's from Gregory Amato. Dave?
I think that is naturally going to happen. So you're always going to get some drop off from one book to another, just because that unfortunately people keep writing good books that distract people, and then they start new things.
Selfish.
I know, seriously. So yeah, that's going to happen, but you hope that what you write is going to be good enough to kind of pull people along eventually. And I kind of think if you're writing a long series, you kind of you're laying a foundational investment for many years too, because there's no reason why somebody has to just be reading it while you're writing it, or just like within a couple of years of you releasing it. Hopefully it will stand a little bit of the test of time afterwards too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Megan, I think this is probably one for you. As an indie debut author starting out, do you publish all 3 stories in a trilogy in one go to get readers invested, or risk losing momentum with a year-long wait?
Yes. No.
Excellent.
If you can do that,
there you go. You heard it here.
I can't. I discovered this. No.
I'm so hard, but makeup's going to be all down my face by the end of this.
So I think, yeah, I think if you're indie, it's doing the rapid release, which is, you can Google search that because I'm sure stuff comes up. But basically what that means is trying to, launch all the books, or the first 3 books in the series, depending on how long your series is, launch them relatively quickly. So not all at once, because what you want to do, now we're getting into algorithms and marketing and commercial aspects of things, but what your goal is to get a snowball effect on all the algorithms. So you launch book 1, you get some readers in there, you get some good reviews, and then you launch book 2, which actually brings attention back to book 1 again. So you get more readers, you get more reviews, who then move on to book 2, and then you launch book 3 shortly thereafter. So you're trying to go after, in that scenario, you're trying to go after the voracious readers, mostly, to be fair, on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited. And it's a system that works for a whole lot of indie authors. I'm not one of them because I just don't write that fast. I try really hard, but I've got 2 little kids, and so
I feel your pain.
Yeah. So I'm slow. Bear with me. So if you can do that, it is a great way to launch a debut. The risk, of course, with anything, and it's the same with traditional, and this is why the traditional publishers generally pick up book 1, maybe 2 books to start out with, but they pick up book 1 to see how it does, right? So by publishing the first book and then kind of waiting to see kind of what readers are saying and how much interest you're getting, you can kind of judge whether or not that series is worth pursuing further. With indies, the risk is you just don't get much visibility anyway. So publishing 3, maybe that's your investment on that first book, is really the first 3. So it's always a debate. I think you definitely do lose interest if you wait more than a few months or a year. Definitely more than a year, you're kind of you become
starting again, maybe.
But
the traditional model is obviously a book comes out. The traditional publishing is obviously a book comes out once every year. But what Orbit did for me and some other debut authors was that they gave me a longer lead time up front. So my first book came out, and then the next 2 came out 6 months apart. Mm-hmm. So normally it would have taken 3 years, but after 2 years, I had the first trilogy out and it's done. It's then a case of I now can't write at the same pace that I did before because they give me a longer lead time. And everyone's like, so when's the next one out? That one's actually now going to take a year. But by the same token, I've got 3 books out there. So someone can say, oh, there's a complete story, and they can read it and whilst they wait for the next one. So they're traditional publishing sometimes borrowing from the kind of the indie publishing approach.
Yeah.
Okay. A couple people are asking, supposed to ask about influences, but I think we'll perhaps leave that to maybe a more relevant panel. Someone's asking about maps for fantasy worlds. So I suppose if you've got a series, do you link in artwork? Does anybody have a particular opinion on that one?
Go on, Dave.
I'm probably going to disagree with you then by that noise, because that sound you made. Because I think every fantasy book should have a map, and really good fantasy books have more than one map. So
how many maps have you got, Dave?
In this one, there's like 3 maps.
I guess.
You know what? You don't have to apologise for your map loving, David. Dave, say it proud. I love maps. It's okay.
I love maps. I like making maps. I think maps are great. Yeah. You don't have to look at it, Stephen. Yeah. Oh, okay, Megan. Well, I'm sure your books are great.
I mean, you know what though? It's a fair point. It depends on which subgenre of fantasy you write as well. You know, if you're writing the big epic tomes with lots of walking, having a map is helpful.
Right.
If you're writing action adventure shorter books, I'm not sure a map is necessary. Although I've gotten requests for them for my books as well. So, you know, I think there's a certain segment of the reader population that really enjoys them. So
Dave's
some
their
people
king.
really, really want a map and have contacted me and said, do you have a map? And I said, well, I have a hand-drawn one that I do for myself. Can you send me that one? No. No. Well, why not? Because it's just for me. So, but anyway, there is a new book. In my new series, there is a map. So, Dave, you'll be happy. Okay.
That's good. It's very selfish not sharing what you've got there, Stephen.
I'll email it to you later.
Okay.
Right, guys. Okay, so there's no more questions coming up at the moment. I can't see. So I'm going to go probably to my final question, which is about the series finale. So you've been working on a series of books, and the ending, as we've kind of established quite a few times tonight, is that it really has to be your crowning glory. So how do you keep the tension going, and how do you avoid Deus Ex Machina?
I'll let you know.
Me too.
Okay, good.
Okay, planning. That's what I did.
You what,
see? That's where planning. That's where it pays
planning
off.
Yes.
Just saying. Yeah, I had finished my second trilogy, and I was essentially, for all intents and purposes, wrapping up that world for the time being. So 6 novels and a novella. I may revisit it in the future, but if I don't, I had to wrap up everything in a satisfying way. So I think it took me longer to write that 6th book than any of the others, because I kept thinking, oh, what about so-and-so? Shouldn't I tie off that thing? Yeah. And what about this? There are some threads left over, but they're not the major ones. So I was able to go back and think about all the things I was trying to accomplish in all the previous books. And if I was reading this for the first time, not just payoffs, but for the story, but for the characters, I wanted their arcs to come to a satisfying, or at least an interesting conclusion, with some things you can say that, oh, they don't just all walk off into the sunset. They might go off and do this or that. And that's quite an interesting thing. It's to kind of make people, it's going to go, oh, and they all live happily after. Great. Well, and
have you left anything open, Stephen, that in case you do want to revisit, or have you really kind of drawn a line under it?
There are some things there, but if it didn't continue, it was satisfying enough. People wouldn't be like, oh God, I'm never going to find out what happened to him and his dog. Oh, now it's, the dog's dead. That's it. So
what? No, I don't know. Great. So 6 books and the dog dies at the end of, right, okay, I need to read it now.
You can never kill any pets in any book. People, fine. Any pets, any animals, you can't do it. There's a little tip for everybody. Just say, there's no dead animals in my book.
There's actually a website called Does the Dog Die, in case you can check before watching a movie, and I have used it.
Fair enough. See? Planning, okay. That's how you do it.
Dave, the ending.
Well, I'm glad to hear Stephen say that, because I haven't got to my ending yet, but I actually ended up taking like 2 months at the end of last year to plot out the rest of my series. And so part of that was not only kind of like working out what was going to happen in the last book and the major events and the twists that are in there, but I actually went through and for like 20 major characters, worked out their arcs from where they are now to the end of the book. And they all kind of feel satisfying. And some of them come to a messy end, and some of them do get to ride off
but their pets are
with
okay.
their dogs. Yeah. Generally, I think so. Yeah. So yeah. Didn't you think that it was? It's like, you know, my daughter. This is an aside. She loves Harry Potter, and so Dumbledore dies, Sirius Black dies, but when
Spoiler
Hedwig
alert.
dies, yeah, sorry.
Oh man.
But then a
Excuse me?
certain
Well,
flappy
that's okay,
thing
guys.
dies. There's a 20-second delay. Quick, press the button.
Except that's going to come after you already said it.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
Anyway, Harry Potter.
You're
go
a
on.
planner.
yeah, I'll stop
Okay,
there.
listen. Right, guys, we're nearly to wrap up because we have another panel coming up right after, which I have lost my sheet, so I can't remember what it was. There you go. Apologies. Just want to say thank you so much to the panelists, Stephen Arian, Megan Haskell and DP Williscroft. You guys have been absolutely fantastic. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of QuaranCon. Please don't forget to visit Artists Alley, and I want to say a huge big thank you to the audience for joining in and for your questions. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Erica, sign us out.